While the world watches decade after decade as conflicts in the Middle East continue in endless cycles of violence, few remember the philosopher who proposed a third way. An alternative that did not involve domination, expulsion, or separation, but a genuine encounter between two peoples. Buber was no naive dreamer. He was a rigorous intellectual, a university professor, a deep student of human nature. He knew history, understood politics, and experienced tension firsthand. And even so, or perhaps precisely because of that, he insisted that coexistence was possible. His proposal was rejected by the leaders of his time. They called him a traitor, a utopian, a danger. But what if they were wrong? What if Buber saw something others could not? Today, when the world seems more divided than ever, when we increasingly view the other as the enemy, perhaps it's time to revisit the ideas of this extraordinary man, not out of romantic nostalgia, but because his reflections on authentic, human encounter might be exactly what we need to understand, and maybe even resolve. Not only the conflict in the Middle East, but also our broader difficulty in living together. It was 1878 when Martin Buber was born into a family already marked by the contradictions of its time. Vienna was teeming with new ideas, revolutionary art, and political tensions that would define the next century. The Buber's were assimilated, cultured, prosperous Jews, precisely the kind of family that benefited from the liberal openness of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, yet also felt the rising waves of anti-Semitism. Young Martin grew up between two worlds. At home, he breathed German culture, Western philosophy, Enlightenment values. But in the eyes of neighbors, in the streets of Vienna, in the universities he would later attend, he was always the Jew. This identity tension did not destroy him. It forged him. When his parents divorced, Martin went to live with his paternal grandparents. And it was there, in the home of Salomon Buber, that his life took an unexpected turn. His grandfather was a respected Talmudic scholar, deeply knowledgeable in Jewish tradition. But he was no blind traditionalist. He was an intellectual capable of bridging the ancient world of sacred texts with the modern issues of his time. It was Salomon who introduced Martin to the world of Jewish mysticism, especially the Hasidic, texts that would later become central to his grandson's work. But he did so in a particular way, not as dogma to be accepted, but as wisdom to be questioned, understood, and lived. Young Buber absorbed everything with an almost feverish intensity. He studied philosophy at university, devoured Kant and Nietzsche, participated in debates on art and politics. At the same time, he delved deeper and deeper into the stories of Hasidic masters, parables about transformative encounters between ordinary people and the sacred dimension of life. This combination, Western philosophical rigor and Eastern mystical wisdom, seemed strange to his university peers. How could someone be a modern thinker and a student of ancient traditions at the same time? Buber saw no contradiction. For him, the central question was always the same. How do human beings relate to one another authentically? Still young, Buber became involved in the emerging Zionist movement, but from the beginning his approach was different. While Theodor Herzl and other leaders focused on building a Jewish state, Buber was interested in something he called a spiritual renaissance. For him, the return to the land of Israel should not merely be a practical solution to anti-Semitism, but an opportunity for cultural and ethical renewal. In 1901, at just 23 years old, he became editor of Die Welt, the official publication of the Zionist movement. But his ideas were already making others uneasy. Buber questioned, what was the point of creating a Jewish state if it would reproduce the same vices, the same injustices, the same patterns of domination found in European states? Wouldn't it be better to envision a truly new society, founded on different principles? These questions gradually distanced him from mainstream political Zionism. Buber began developing his own vision, cultural Zionism. The idea was that Jews first needed to renew their spiritual and ethical identity before building any political structure, and this renewal necessarily had to include a respectful relationship with the Arabs already living in Palestine. By age 25, Buber was already recognized as a promising intellectual, but also as a troubling figure. His Zionist colleagues saw him as overly idealistic. Traditional academics considered him too mystical. And Buber? He continued his singular quest, convinced that the answer to humanity's great problems lay somewhere between reason and intuition, between tradition and modernity, between the individual and the collective. What he didn't yet know was that this quest would lead him to develop one of the most influential philosophies of the 20th century, and a radical proposal for the future of the Middle East. The work that would forever change the way we think about human relationships was born from a seemingly simple experience. In 1914, Buber was in his office when a young man came to see him. The boy was clearly distressed, needing guidance, perhaps even help to make an important decision. Buber received him politely, answered his questions courteously, but was mentally distracted, thinking about other matters. The young man left apparently satisfied. Weeks later, Buber learned that he had committed suicide. This experience haunted him for years. It wasn't just the weight of guilt, but a deeper realization. He had failed to truly meet that young man. He had answered his questions, but he had not connected with his soul. He had treated him as a case to be solved, not as a whole person to be understood. From that painful reflection arose the distinction that would become the heart of Buber's entire philosophy. The difference between I-it and I-thou. Relationships. The I-it world is the world of objectification, of utility, of experience. When we relate to something or someone in the I-it mode, we are essentially turning the other into an object of our experience, knowledge, or use. This isn't necessarily wrong. It's impossible to live without this kind of relationship. When you pick up a book to read, drive a car, or even when a doctor examines a patient, you are in the I-it world. The problem arises when this becomes our only mode of relating. When we treat other people only as objects of our experience, we lose something fundamental about our humanity. The young man who came to Buber was an extreme example. He was treated as a case, a problem to be solved, not as a full person, with fears, hopes, and inner depth. The I-thou world is completely different. Here, there is no objectification, no use, no analysis. In the I-thou encounter, we recognize the other as a complete being, with their own dignity, with an inner life as rich and complex as our own. We do not try to know or use this person, we simply meet them in their wholeness. Buber insisted that these I-thou encounters cannot be forced, planned, or controlled. They happen spontaneously, when we truly open ourselves to the other. They may last seconds or hours, and can occur between close friends or complete strangers. What characterizes them is not duration or context, but the quality of the meeting, the mutual recognition of two subjectivities that touch without objectifying. And here lies the revolutionary aspect of Buber's philosophy. He applied this distinction not only to personal relationships but to all dimensions of human life. Religion, art, education, politics, all could be lived in the I-it or I-thou mode. In religion, for example, Buber criticized both atheism and traditional theism. For him, God was not an object to be known or denied, but a presence to be encountered. The eternal thou, as he called it, manifested through authentic encounters between people. It was not a distant deity to be worshipped, but a dimension of reality that revealed itself when we truly related to one another. In education, this meant that the teacher should not merely transmit information, an I-it relationship with knowledge, but meet the student as a whole person. True learning happened when educator and learner mutually recognized each other as beings in growth. In art, the genuine artist did not manipulate materials to express preconceived ideas, but met the work in creation, allowing themselves to be transformed by the creative process as much as they transformed the material. But it was in politics that the implications of the I-thou philosophy became most radical and controversial. If every person is a thou, a being with dignity, depth, and intrinsic rights, then no group can legitimately dominate another. No people can treat another people merely as an obstacle to be removed or a resource to be exploited. This perception, completely transformed Buber's view of Zionism. He still believed in the right of Jews to return to the land of Israel, but now he saw that this return would only be ethically valid if it happened through true encounter with the Arabs who already inhabited the region. It could not be conquest, domination, or expulsion. It had to be an encounter. For Buber, the question was not whether Jews had a historical right to Palestine, or whether Arabs had the right to remain in the land they had lived in for generations. Both had legitimate rights. The question was, could two peoples meet as mutual thous, recognizing each other's dignity and rights, and build something new together? This question became the obsession of his life, and the answer he found was as simple as it was revolutionary. Yes, it was possible, but only if both sides could move out of the I-it mode, where the other is seen as obstacle or enemy, and into the I-thou mode, where the other is recognized as a legitimate partner in building a shared future. Of course, this would require profound transformations on both sides. Zionists would have to abandon any fantasy of an empty land or any solution involving the expulsion of Arabs. Arab nationalists would have to accept the Jewish presence as legitimate and permanent. Both would have to learn to see the other not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a neighbor with whom to share the land. Did it seem impossible? Perhaps. But Buber believed that the alternative, two peoples eternally viewing each other as existential threats, would be far worse for everyone involved. In 1923, at the age of 45, he published I and Thou, the small book that contained these revolutionary ideas. The work was received with interest in intellectual circles, but many considered its political implications too utopian to be taken seriously. Buber didn't care about the criticism. He knew he had discovered something fundamental about human nature and was determined to live according to that discovery. In the years to come, this would lead him to make decisions that would radically change his life and place him at the heart of one of the most complex conflicts of the 20th century. The chapter narrates Buber's emigration to Palestine, his first impressions and the clash between his philosophical ideals and the complex reality of the conflict. It ends with a natural transition to the next chapter, which explores his differences with dominant political Zionism. Let me know when you approve so we can proceed to Chapter 5, The Zionist Dilemma Between Herzl and Reality. 75. Years after the creation of the State of Israel, peace between Jews and Arabs remains an unfulfilled promise. On the contrary, the current reality is marked by a constant cycle of fear, distrust, and violence. What could once have been a bold experiment in coexistence has, in practice, become a reality of separation. Geographical, ideological, and spiritual. In the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas on the planet, a predominantly Palestinian population has lived under blockade for nearly 2 decades. Strict border control, scarcity of resources, and frequent armed conflict between Hamas and the Israeli army have made daily life there unbearable. Cycles of bombings and retaliation have raised an entire generation that has only known war. In the West Bank, the expansion of Israeli settlements and ongoing clashes with Palestinian communities fuel a constant state of tension. Checkpoints, separation walls, and military patrols are part of the daily routine for thousands. Frustration is growing, both among Palestinians and among Jews who long for peace. Meanwhile, political discourse rarely points to lasting solutions. The language of force still prevails over that of dialogue. Jerusalem, a sacred city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, has become the symbolic center of an ongoing dispute. In every ancient stone of the old city, there seems to be a cry for belonging, and also for exclusivity. What should be a space of meeting between traditions has often become a field of tension and rivalry. The language of conflict has infiltrated even everyday relationships. In many contexts, a name, an accent, or an item of clothing is enough to spark suspicion. Jews and Arabs share the same land but largely live in parallel universes, separated by physical walls and emotional ones. Of course, there are exceptions. Movements, NGOs, bilingual schools, and families who challenge hatred with gestures of reconciliation do exist. but they are points of light in the midst of deep darkness. In official politics, on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides, such gestures rarely translate into concrete public policies. International support, in turn, is often polarized. Some unconditionally defend Israel, others see the Palestinians only as victims. But few are willing, or brave enough, to consider the real complexity of the situation. Today, speaking of solutions is risky. Trying to promote dialogue may seem to many naive or even a betrayal. It is in this context that Martin Buber's ideas re-emerge, as both a mirror and a provocation. What he proposed in the early 20th century was not merely a philosophical project, but a real, if utopian, alternative to the path of division and hostility. Looking at the present, we see how that path was ignored or abandoned. Buber's vision of a binational state, with equal rights for Jews and Arabs, now sounds like a distant mirage. The two-state solution, once widely championed on the international stage, has also lost strength in the face of current realities on the ground. In a way, we are facing a historical impasse. Traditional solutions appear to be exhausted. Moral fatigue is palpable, and yet reality demands a response. Maintaining the status quo is not enough. Something must change, not only in political structures, but in how each side views the other. That is where Buber becomes relevant again, not as a mythical figure, but as a thinker who pointed to an alternative path, one that is deeply ethical, relational, and spiritual. His ideas may not offer a technical solution to the conflict, but they offer something perhaps even more valuable: a new way of seeing. And perhaps, before we speak of peace treaties, we must first relearn how to see. To see the other not as an enemy, but as a neighbor. Not as a threat, but as someone who, like us, wants to live with dignity. To understand where this singular and challenging worldview came from, we must return to the beginning. We must understand the young Martin Buber. Who was he? What did he live through? And what forces shaped him to the point of believing that dialogue is not just possible, but essential? To understand how Martin Buber came to propose such a counterintuitive model of coexistence at the heart of an age-old conflict, it is necessary to go back to the beginning of his life. Long before becoming an ethical and philosophical reference, he was just an orphaned boy, marked by absence and a silent search for a meaningful bond. Martin Buber was born on February 8, 1878 in Vienna, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His parents, assimilated Jews, separated when he was still very young. At the age of 3, he was sent to live with his paternal grandparents in Lemberg, today part of Ukraine, but at the time one of the main cities of Galicia, a vibrant stronghold of traditional Judaism. His grandfather, Solomon Buber, was a renowned scholar of the Talmud and rabbinic Jewish literature. With him, young Martin came into contact with the rigor of traditional thought and the richness of Jewish spirituality, even though later he would follow a path different from Orthodox religion. The environment was filled with books, debates, and stories, a true laboratory of ideas that would leave a lasting mark on him. At the same time, Buber's childhood was permeated by a kind of emotional loneliness. The absence of his parents and the emotional distance of the adults around him generated in him a deep longing for connection. This silent childhood wound would paradoxically become the source of his greatest intellectual contribution, the notion that the human being only fully realizes himself in relation to the other. Already in his youth, Buber dove voraciously into university studies. He studied philosophy, art history, and philology in Vienna, Leipzig, Zurich, and Berlin. He was strongly influenced by thinkers such as Kant, Nietzsche, and Dilthey. But unlike many intellectuals of his time, he did not confine himself to academic rationalism. From early on, he showed interest in lived experience, and especially in mysticism and spirit. One of the most striking moments of this phase was his encounter with Hasidism, a Jewish mystical movement born in the 18th century, which valued joy, direct experience with God, and divine presence in everyday life. Buber was enchanted by the stories of the Hasidic masters, which seemed to narrate a concrete, embodied spirituality, full of humanity. Rather than simply studying them, he retold these stories. In 1906, he published the book, The Tales of the Hasidim, Die Geschichten der Chassidim, which would become one of his best-known works. In it, Buber not only preserves tradition, but translates it into a modern language, accessible and deeply moving. This book was not merely a bridge between eras, it was a bridge between souls. But his interest in spirituality was not limited to Judaism. Buber read and engaged in dialogue with Eastern traditions, Christianity, and existentialist thinkers. In everything he read, he sought the same thread. How can human beings meet authentically without being reduced to instruments, functions, or enemies? This quest would lead him, in 1923, to formulate his most famous idea, the distinction between two modes of relating to the world, I, it, and I, thou. In the first, we treat everything and everyone as objects. In the second, we open ourselves to the presence of the other as a whole, irreducible, unique being. It was a philosophy of presence, listening and encounter. Martin Buber was one of the Jewish intellectuals who adopted Zionism in the early 20th century, but his Zionism had a fundamental peculiarity. He vehemently rejected any form of exclusive nationalism that denied the rights of the Arabs who already lived in the land. For Buber, the creation of a Jewish state should not be a project of domination, but one of coexistence and mutual respect. Zionism, the movement that sought the return of the Jewish people to Palestine, had various currents and views. Some, especially the political and pragmatic, saw the founding of the state as a matter of Jewish survival and sovereignty, often at the expense of the local Arab inhabitants. Others, like Buber, believed that the true future of Israel depended on a deep understanding between the two communities. His perspective was shaped both by his personal experience and by the intellectual environment in which he was immersed. In Jerusalem, where he settled in the 1930s, he witnessed firsthand the complexity of coexistence between Jews and Arabs, a coexistence marked by tensions, but also by possibilities for dialogue. Buber advocated the idea of a binational state, in which Jews and Arabs would have equal rights and govern together. For him, the land was a gift to be shared, not an exclusive possession to be conquered or defended by violent means. This vision directly opposed the dominant idea that there would only be security for the Jews if the Arabs were marginalized or expelled. Buber saw that as a sure path to permanent conflict. He believed that true peace would only be possible if both peoples recognized the humanity of the other, what he called the I-thou relationship, in which the other is not an enemy or an object but a partner in dialogue. Besides the binational state, Buber proposed that society be built on cooperative communities like the kibbutzim, where Jews and Arabs could live and work together as equals. He saw in these concrete experiences a model of coexistence that could be expanded. However, his ideas were not well received by most Zionist leaders, who prioritized the formation of a strong and independent Jewish nation, often supported by the exclusion of Palestinians. Buber was criticized as being too idealistic, utopian, and even naive. Despite the criticism and political difficulties, he never abandoned his vision. In speeches and writings, Buber continued to insist that dialogue and mutual recognition were the only viable path for the region's future. His efforts also included meetings and attempts at dialogue with Arab leaders, which at the time was rare and even risky. He believed that only by looking into the eyes of the other and listening to their stories could a real bridge be built. Therefore, his struggle was both philosophical and practical. He did not just write about encounter, but tried to live it and promote it in his own political and social action. Yet the historical context was not favorable. The growing hostility between Jews and Arabs, international pressure, the advance of Nazism in Europe, and Palestinian resistance movements created an increasingly tense and difficult scenario for his ideas to be implemented. The UN plan in 1947, which proposed dividing Palestine into two separate states, was a blow to Buber's idea. For him, territorial separation would not solve the fundamental problems of human and political relations between the peoples. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the war that followed, the dream of a binational state practically disappeared from official debate, buried under years of armed conflict, forced migrations, and strict security policies. Even so, Buber continued his intellectual work and activism, writing and speaking about the importance of dialogue. He saw the conflict not just as a political issue, but as a spiritual challenge, which demanded a profound change of consciousness from all involved. His message was clear: without recognizing the humanity of the other, without the ability to listen and respect, any solution will be only temporary. A peace treaty may be signed, but true peace is born only from the I-thou relationship. This vision, radical and at the same time deeply human, still resonates today when many wonder how to transform conflict into coexistence. As we move forward in Buber's history, we will see how this philosophy of encounter influenced his work at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and how he tried to build bridges even amid growing difficulties. Martin Buber was one of the Jewish intellectuals who adopted Zionism in the early 20th century, but his Zionism had a fundamental peculiarity. He vehemently rejected any form of exclusive nationalism that denied the rights of the Arabs who already lived in the land. For Buber, the creation of a Jewish state should not be a project of domination, but one of coexistence and mutual respect. Zionism, the movement that sought the return of the Jewish people to Palestine, had various currents and views. Some, especially the political and pragmatic, saw the founding of the state as a matter of Jewish survival and sovereignty, often at the expense of the local Arab inhabitants. Others, like Buber, believed that the true future of Israel depended on a deep understanding between the two communities. His perspective was shaped both by his personal experience and by the intellectual environment in which he was immersed. In Jerusalem, where he settled in the 1930s, he witnessed firsthand the complexity of coexistence between Jews and Arabs, a coexistence marked by tensions, but also by possibilities for dialogue. Buber advocated the idea of a binational state, in which Jews and Arabs would have equal rights and govern together. For him, the land was a gift to be shared, not an exclusive possession to be conquered or defended by violent means. This vision directly opposed the dominant idea that there would only be security for the Jews if the Arabs were marginalized or expelled. Buber saw that as a sure path to permanent conflict. He believed that true peace would only be possible if both peoples recognized the humanity of the other, what he called the I-thou relationship, in which the other is not an enemy or an object but a partner in dialogue. Besides the binational state, Buber proposed that society be built on cooperative communities like the kibbutzim, where Jews and Arabs could live and work together as equals. He saw in these concrete experiences a model of coexistence that could be expanded. However, his ideas were not well received by most Zionist leaders, who prioritized the formation of a strong and independent Jewish nation, often supported by the exclusion of Palestinians. Buber was criticized as being too idealistic, utopian, and even naive. Despite the criticism and political difficulties, he never abandoned his vision. In speeches and writings, Buber continued to insist that dialogue and mutual recognition were the only viable path for the region's future. His efforts also included meetings and attempts at dialogue with Arab leaders, which at the time was rare and even risky. He believed that only by looking into the eyes of the other and listening to their stories could a real bridge be built. Therefore, his struggle was both philosophical and practical. He did not just write about encounter, but tried to live it and promote it in his own political and social action. Yet the historical context was not favorable. The growing hostility between Jews and Arabs, international pressure, the advance of Nazism in Europe, and Palestinian resistance movements created an increasingly tense and difficult scenario for his ideas to be implemented. The UN plan in 1947, which proposed dividing Palestine into two separate states, was a blow to Buber's idea. For him, territorial separation would not solve the fundamental problems of human and political relations between the peoples. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and the war that followed, the dream of a binational state practically disappeared from official debate, buried under years of armed conflict, forced migrations, and strict security policies. Even so, Buber continued his intellectual work and activism, writing and speaking about the importance of dialogue. He saw the conflict not just as a political issue, but as a spiritual challenge, which demanded a profound change of consciousness from all involved. His message was clear. Without recognizing the humanity of the other, without the ability to listen and respect, any solution will be only temporary. A peace treaty may be signed, but true peace is born only from the I-thou relationship. This vision, radical and at the same time deeply human, still resonates today, when many wonder how to transform conflict into coexistence. As we move forward in Buber's history, we will see how this philosophy of encounter influenced his work at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and how he tried to build bridges even amid growing difficulties. As the 20th century progressed and the foundation of the State of Israel approached, Martin Buber found himself at the center of a profound political and philosophical crossroads. He had spent years advocating for a project of coexistence and dialogue, but the events culminating in 1948 called into question the possibility of realizing that dream. Buber saw the creation of Israel not merely as a political event, but as a moral and spiritual challenge for all involved. For him, the new state should be an expression of justice, responsibility, and mutual recognition, values he believed essential for lasting peace. However, conditions on the ground pointed to a more turbulent path. The UN's 1947 decision to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, was accepted by Zionist leaders but rejected by the Arabs. This sparked a conflict that would become Israel's War of Independence, with dramatic consequences for both populations. Buber lamented the violence and exclusion that marked this period. He viewed with concern the forced exodus of thousands of Palestinians, which he called the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe. To him, this tragedy was a sign that Zionism had strayed from its original ideal of justice and coexistence. His philosophy of encounter was in direct conflict with the political realities of the time. The emerging state would not be binational but predominantly Jewish, with policies that many saw as marginalizing the remaining Arab population. Even faced with this scenario, Buber remained faithful to his vision, insisting that Israel's future depended on the ability to recognize the other as a partner, not an enemy. He criticized both Jewish nationalism that excluded Arabs and Arab movements that rejected any coexistence. In practice, Buber sought to influence policies and discourse. In favor of dialogue and reconciliation, he participated in debates, wrote articles, and maintained correspondence with political leaders and intellectuals, trying to defend his ethical perspective. His political vision was deeply rooted in his philosophy of I and thou. For Buber, recognizing the other in their otherness was the foundation for any just political coexistence. This implied equal rights, respect for cultural and religious differences, and the joint construction of the future. However, the political atmosphere of the time was marked by distrust, fear, and the recent trauma of war and the Holocaust. The existential fear of the Jews encouraged more rigid and defensive stances, while Arab nationalism responded with resistance and armed conflicts. The result was a series of policies and events that consolidated division between the two peoples, greatly hindering the implementation of Buber's dream. Still, he continued to believe in the possibility of a peaceful and ethical solution. An important aspect of Buber's journey was his work at the Hebrew University, where he sought to train a generation of leaders and thinkers capable of transcending the conflict. He saw education as a fundamental tool to change mindsets and open paths for dialogue. Additionally, Buber also argued that Jewish spirituality and ethics should guide political decisions rather than purely pragmatic or national interests. He believed that without this foundation, any state was doomed to repeat cycles of violence. This vision of politics integrated with philosophy and spirituality might seem idealistic, but Buber saw in it an urgency and practical necessity, especially in conflict contexts like the Middle East. In the years following Israel's foundation, Buber maintained his commitment to dialogue, even amid the growing isolation of his ideas. He published works, participated in international congresses, and tried to keep channels open with Arab leaders, hoping understanding was possible. His influence, although limited in official political circles, was profound in intellectual and cultural fields. He inspired peace movements, thinkers and activists seeking alternatives to armed conflict. However, political reality continued moving in directions contrary to his vision. The Six-Day War in 1967, for example, further intensified territorial and political tensions, deepening the conflict's dilemma. Buber passed away in 1965 before these events, but his philosophical legacy remained a beacon for those who believe that human encounter, recognition of the other, and dialogue are the keys to peace. In summary, the foundation of Israel was a complex historic moment marked by achievements and tragedies which challenged Buber's ethical and political vision. His project of a binational state and peaceful coexistence remained unrealized, but his call for dialogue remains more relevant than ever. So, did you like this inspiring story of Martin Buber and his vision of peace for Israel and the peoples living there? If you believe that dialogue and mutual respect can transform even the toughest conflicts, you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content that brings hope and reflection for our time. Leave your like to help. Spread this message and share this video with friends and family who also want to better understand the Middle East, and maybe get inspired to build bridges where many only see walls. And of course, don't forget to leave in the comments what you think about Buber's vision and whether you believe there is still room for dialogue today. Your opinion is very important for us to keep this conversation going. See you in the next video.